Thank you all for joining us. It's a great turnout. So today we're going to be talking about organizational resilience. So before we dive into this great panel, I just want to call a stat to everyone's attention. So in 1955 was the first year of the Fortune 500 list. And of those companies, the 500 companies that were on that list, only 60 today are still on that list. So when we think about organizational resilience, we're thinking about how do you survive creative destruction, how do you remain economically prosperous. And so the panel here today will be talking about that and making sure that you don't just have an organization that survives but thrives 60 years down the road or longer. So Tim, I want to start with you because you're with BSI. Can you just explain to us what organizational resilience is so we all have a good framework?
So I'll explain it. The simplest way for me to talk about organizational resilience is having a company survive and prosper. So that means being able to plan for the little things that are happening, but also worry about the big disastrous things. So the early days of organizational resilience was really about disaster recovery or business continuity, and that's more reactive. Today, as we think about organizational resilience, there's some other aspects which I think are important, which is more forward-looking. So BSI is a company that's been around for a while, a little over 100 years. We're not a public company. We're the British Standards Institution. We write standards for the UK, and we do a lot of other cool things. But our remit is to help businesses survive and prosper and develop best practice to do that. So organizational resilience is one of those things we're very passionate about. We're on our own journey. I won't say we don't sell organizational resilience. I don't say I'm an organizational resilience expert, but there's some things that we've learned through our research. Because we're in a little over 190 countries, working with 86,000 customers a year, we have a view of what organizational resilience looks like, good and bad. And so we're trying to share that with a lot of the things that we put on people's desks, I think, or their chairs, to try to help companies think about organizational resilience from a framework perspective that helps them be better. Because it's not just about an industry or a country. This framework around organizational resilience is applicable no matter who you are.
And there's a few pillars that you guys look at organizational resilience. So we might not use that in everyday speak. So what are those pillars?
So there's three areas of organizational resilience that we look at, that if you could take what an organization does, and because when I say organizational resilience, it's a very high level, big picture. How do you break it down into its pieces? There's a couple of ways. One of the ways is actually breaking it down into maybe some functions. So the three pillars that we look at that really define an organizational resilience framework are operational resilience. So that's kind of your day-to-day stuff, stuff's in your control mostly. That really is kind of the core of your business. Information resilience, that's relatively new. Security is a part of that, and security always has been. But how you protect your data, what you do with that information, how do you protect your consumers and your partners, that's a big piece of it. And then supply chain. So the things that are your inputs, how do you control those? And from a supply chain perspective, some of the challenges we have in global supply chains is we work with a lot of partners, and we don't necessarily, those partners might not have the same view as we do of the world, but they impact our own reputation. So being to work through that supply chain is those pieces. So supply chain resilience, information resilience, and operational resilience are kind of those three frameworks that we work through.
Great. Pat, I want to bring you into this. So at Catalant, you guys work with Fortune 1000 companies. So you have this bird's eye view of how companies are talking about organizational resilience in those pillars. How will you assess organizations' awareness of how important those pillars are?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, the part of it that we really focus on is we often quote a lot of a version of the stat that you gave. And I think the biggest companies out there, one of the biggest things that they're most concerned about is how do we move more quickly. I think the pace of change today, the pace of innovation today is faster than it's ever been. And today it is as slow as it will ever be going forward. And so these large organizations, I think critical for them to be able to compete is to be able to figure out how to go faster. And if you think about it, the fact that they have so many more people, these big organizations, they have so many more people, you would think should be an advantage. It's more knowledge, it's more people working on new things every day, it's more past experience to leverage going forward. But in fact, all of those people actually slow the company down. and they prevent it from being able to go as fast as it could otherwise should be able to go. And so when we meet with these leaders at these organizations, they're often looking around and they're saying, this company just launched a product that we should have gotten to market, or this company just captured market share that we should have been able to capture. And from where we sit, at the end of the day, it's because they aren't able to move fast enough. And so the part that we really focus on is being able to understand what talent you have access to so that you can plug them into the right work at the right time in a far more dynamic, on-demand way, whether they're already inside your organization or outside of it.
Right. And Samir, so at Equinox, you guys currently have about 15,000 employees, and you're growing. Right. So when Pat's talking about talent and who's in our workforce, but where we have to go, I feel like that's a really relevant conversation. So how do you check in as a leader and with other leaders to make sure that you guys are staying healthy as a company?
Yeah, so we're a high growth company. We're about 15,000 employees today. Over the next 5 years, we'll be 20,000 plus. A lot of growth through acquisition, core brand growth, and new brand growth. So we're constantly looking at our organization model, looking at our staff, and assessing our talent to see, do we have the right people in place to take us to where we need to go. So that creates new opportunities for existing people to step into new roles, and also kind of career plan and succession plan. So we're really focused on, as we bring in kind of more entry-level junior folks, how do we define career plans that show them over the next 2, 3, 4 years where they can go and what they need to do to get there. Especially with the younger workforce, we're finding that that's very important to them, and just investing 2 years and knowing that after 2 years I'm going to automatically get here is not how it works nowadays. So just creating specific targets for where they need to go and how they're going to get there. Especially, my lens is more digital and technology focused, and there's so much demand for digital talent these days, and we're not a technology company, so Facebook, Google, Uber, these guys are throwing ridiculous numbers to people, and it's really hard to attract and retain talent in this space. So we're really kind of looking at things in a little bit different way of how we can show them where they can go, and putting them on a path.
And speaking about like the younger workforce that you're trying to attract, so are you seeing that they want something different than workers have won it in the past? Yeah, more experienced workers, more mature workers have won it in the past. And what is that?
Yeah, I think it's the younger workforce. Like I said, one is career plan and knowing where they're going to go. Two is being able to work on something that has purpose. So as a brand, we're fortunate to be able to develop products and services that are helping people live healthier lives, and that's a big point of attraction for talent when we bring them in. They're going to be building technology that's going to help people live healthier and live a more kind of fulfilling, maximized lifestyle. So I think that's really important versus going to a company that stands for a different purpose or different value that's not as tangible and real.
Can I make a comment? I was actually reading, I think it was just a stat. I was reading something last week, and they were quoting the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there was a stat that stuck out to me, and it was the average worker that, let's say, that was born in the 60s to 80s. By the time they were age 32, they had 2 jobs. That was the stat. Today, it's 4 to 5.
Wow.
It's somewhere between 4 and 5. So there's a lot of things that play, I think, from a resilient standpoint. Now, so at the center of organizational resilience is people, process, and product. And that people aspect is so critical. I think we missed the talk on culture. I heard it was really good from WW, and there's some quotes in there that I wish I could pull out. But that culture aspect is really important. I have a 18-year-old daughter, and I'm looking in her eyes. I'm looking at the world through her eyes, and which is really strange. But as I look at that, there's something fascinating. This where I grew up, I wanted to go work for big companies. I wanted to go work for companies that I would have a career with. She's looking at it very different. She's like, these big companies aren't necessarily who I want to work for. I want something that I believe in. I think you said purpose. I think fit for a purpose. I had one of my colleagues, her daughter had got an offer from one of the fastest growing technology companies to go to work for, and she turned it down to work for a little boutique company where she's very little growth opportunity, but the company is what she believes in. So there is something different about this purpose, and an aspect of a company isn't just producing good products anymore. What does the company represent? And what's our reputation, and what do you want to be known for? Because that attracts and retains talent, and that's a hard thing, because especially if you have people running in and out quickly, if they have more jobs, how do you have that culture? And as a leader, that's something that I think about often. What kind of culture am I creating, and what does this organization stand for?
Yeah, I think just to take another angle on that, a big part of our business is we have a marketplace of freelancers. And I think when people think about the freelance economy, they think about the millennials, and they like to kind of blame the millennials for people wanting to work differently. And I'm kind of like right on the edge of the definition of a millennial, so I'll claim it if it's convenient. I won't claim it. And what's really interesting, though, is in our marketplace of 50,000 freelancers, these are very high-end business experts, the average age is 42 years old. And I think that's really interesting. And I think what our perspective on it really is not that this is a millennial thing, but this is a technology enabling people to have more choice and control over who they work with, where they work from, and when they work. And what we see inside of organizations is I think people recognize that they now have more power and they have a say, and the power doesn't lie in the hands of the employer as it historically has. It used to be the case that when I graduated from college, I got a job offer from a company in Washington, D.C., and that was it for me. That company dictated where I lived, when I went to work, what I worked on every day, what hours I was there, what building I was sitting in, what seat I was in. And today, technology has flipped that. Technology has made it possible for people to connect into opportunities in a way that they just never have been able to before. And so I think you see a lot of that in the millennial population, because those are people who grew up with technology and feel more comfortable working with it and sort of trust that person who's on the other side of it. But at the end of the day, I believe this is just enabling people who have high skills and an interest in working in a different way to go about doing it. The other interesting thing I think that we've seen is many of the attributes that make people choose to go and work in the freelance economy are actually now being pulled into the way that organizations themselves are working. So you were sort of referring to that at Equinox. A lot of companies are realizing that people are choosing to become freelancers because they want to have a set of experiences. They don't want to be on the typical career path that they've traditionally been on. They want to be able to say, I want to use these skills on these types of projects, and then I want to move on to something else that's interesting. And so many large organizations, what we're seeing, are trying to create that same experience for their own employees, not for the sake of making those employees happy, but for the sake of actually getting better business outcomes, getting the right people onto the right work in a far more dynamic way, and onto work that they actually care about and want to be committed to.
Right, so if you're already a large organization and you've been going down this path, how do you make sure that you're bringing in all those elements that this new emerging workforce wants in a work experience?
Yeah, so I can take that. I mean, I think for us, one thing that we found successful from a technology perspective is, people want to work on things that they're passionate about and want some personal time as well. So, Google has done a kind of really good job of figuring out how to create personal project time. So we're adopting principles like that and creating what we call kind of a hack day or hackathon type thing, where once or twice every few months we'll allow our entire team to figure out kind of initiatives that they want to work on, give them 24 to 36 hours to kind of go and build out functioning kind of prototypes of that using the resources of the team, and then present and pitch effectively to the executive leadership team what they've built. And one of those ideas will get selected and then get further into kind of development, so to say, and ultimately get into the hands of consumers. But it allows our team to be able to interact with more progressive technology, allows them to work on things that are not kind of mandated by the company, but interesting pieces of technology that they are passionate about, and some really interesting kind of unique things have come out of that. And it feels like that kind of fosters retention ultimately.
There's some other things I think that we've seen. That one of the things that we look at is community engagement or social responsibility. What I found has worked, because it's still in a work in progress, is that the company mandated at a high level, we got to do social responsibility. That actually doesn't work out so well. We've got to be socially responsible. And then, the senior leaders said, you're responsible for driving a program. What I have found that works really well is we're going to do social responsibility, putting the committees and having the employees engage in that social responsibility aspect to be able to engage and help direct the company on things that they're really interested in doing. I found has worked really well with our organization. I'm not saying that works for every organization, but for us to flip it upside down and say social responsibility is a leadership challenge, but not a leadership obligation. We want to put that responsibility at our employees level and then help them bring that up.
Yeah, I would say we've seen companies really start to fundamentally question whether the organizational structure that they've had for the past 50 years actually makes sense for the next 50 years. And so many of you have probably heard the term Agile Transformation. And it's effectively, in a lot of cases, taking, if you go to Bain, McKinsey, BCG's website right now, it's one of the like first, second, or third projects, which tells you that that's what senior executives are talking to them about at a lot of these big companies. And a lot of, and it's effectively taking a lot of the practices from agile product development and trying to bring it into the way that the business side operates. And the concept is basically work in a more mission-based way. Get people onto teams where the bureaucracy is moved away and they have the ability to go and work toward an outcome and be iterative and fail and be more customer-centric. And so we see a lot of organizations that are, in fact, trying to bring much of what's worked in the product development world into the way that they operate as a business. Whether that's explicitly kind of big A agile or more little A agile, try and bring the notion of prioritizing speed over accuracy, including at some of the biggest companies in the world where it's hard to imagine that they would want to shift from accuracy to prioritizing speed. We work with a lot of companies in the oil and gas industry. And I sat with a C-level executive there who said, we are going to shift the way we prioritize, and we are going to tell our employees to prioritize speed over accuracy. And think about like how fundamental that is for an oil and gas company. Like they're building rigs in like the middle of the ocean, and they're sitting there telling their employees that it's about being fast. It's no longer about being accurate for us. And I think that is a fundamental shift that many organizations are now trying to make. And I think that when they make that fundamental shift, to be able to do that well, you have to redefine what it means to be a manager. You have to redefine what your organizational structure should actually look like. You have to redefine how you prioritize and staff work. But if you can do that and you can prioritize speed, you can become more customer-centric, you can get work done faster, and you can go and capture that market share that those smaller companies are beating you to.
And obviously, organizational resilience is about guarding against future risk and just being a strong company. So why isn't everyone doing it? Like, what are the challenges going into 2019 that companies are facing to like really securing that?
I think everybody's working on it. That's the thing. I don't think I can say tomorrow I'll be organizational resilient. It's a journey. As we look at organizational resilience from our work that we've done. And with studies, there's kind of 5 phases. And the first one is more kind of I'll say the basics. It was 1960s, 1970s, your SOPs, right? You got your standard operating procedures, that's what you do. Then it moved to, well, not everything works in that SOP. How do I react to the things that aren't there? And then I got good at that, and then I said, well, how do that third phase is really taking this step, well, we've got these SOPs, we've got decent mitigation steps, now how do I get better at it? And then that fourth step is actually kind of relatively in the last 20, 30 years, is really how do I create the space that I want to be in? How do I more proactively go into the market? How do I lead there? And this fifth phase is actually the one that I think we all struggle with. We call it paradoxical thinking. It's actually, you have to have all 4 of those phases to be a resilient business. The question is, what is the tension between those quadrants, because you put those in 4 quadrants. What are the tensions that you need in where you are today? And then what does your future look like? And we did this exercise. We took the top 100 leaders of BSI and we did this exercise of actually mapping kind of these tensions out. And it was fascinating, the difference between what the top 10 said and the next 90. And then you start having some really interesting discussions. Are we resilient or not? And then we're going to move that down to the next level of the organization. But it's understanding where you are today, but really having a vision of where you want to go and then working towards it. And that vision will continue to change, I think, because our times are changing. You get some facts. There's lots of these companies aren't going to be around, or you're not going to be as relative as you were in the past if you don't become resilient. You have to be on that resilient journey.
Yeah, I would say from where I sit, I think you see a lot of companies where to basically question what your organizational structure looks like, what the definition of a manager is, how you're going to prioritize and do work and staff people to work, that is like fundamental to the way that your business operates. And so there's a lot of friction to actually deciding that you want to go about doing that change. So we work with a lot of companies that I think got to the point of feeling like they absolutely had to do something differently before they hit a point of failure, or certainly heading in the wrong direction at a faster pace. But we work with a large financial institution that took a very big part of their business and said, we're going to shift the way this business operates. We're going to make it operate with more agility. We're going to throw away the org structure. And they hit a quarter where they basically didn't get anything done, like almost didn't get anything done. And that's because they had to invest in the fact that they were going to make this change. And now what the woman who runs the business will tell you is that they have gotten twice as much work done this year as they did last year, and next year they'll get twice as much more done with the same number of people. But like it requires that amount of investment, and it requires that desire to go about the hard exercise of going through that change. And so I think sometimes you see companies that wait too long to go about doing it. But I think if you believe that people want to work in a different way, and you believe that your company needs to figure out how to go faster and operate more like a lot of these startups operate, then I think you have to decide to go about making that change and deal with all the difficulties associated with it.
Samir, how often are you thinking about this? It might not be like you're walking into a meeting on organizational resilience, but like, how are you thinking about this?
Yeah, no, I think just like what we're saying, I think it's every company is thinking about it at different levels of maturity. For us, we're thinking about it as well. And one way we're tackling or approaching it is, we're an operating business. The day job is obviously the day job, but how do we break off and create a separate, maybe leaner organization that's focused more on emerging technology, innovative opportunities, looking at startups, understanding what's going on, and kind of decouple that a little bit from the core part of the operating business. Because there's going to be a lot of churn there, that you're going to look at 10, 15 different opportunities, and maybe one or two actually stick. That takes a lot of time. So once you find the one or two, we can figure out how to integrate it back into the main organization. But having a separate team that's leaner, that can be more nimble, has proven to be more successful for us, and we're able to vet through a lot more opportunities and not get kind of slowed down by the bureaucracy and the overall kind of size of the larger organization. And that's worked well in the kind of tech digital space, and we're now expanding that into other parts of the business as well.
And Tim, how, I know it's not one size fits all. So we have people from all different industries in this room. So how do you walk away and apply it to your industry, like what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I think we work with all industries, and that's why I think organizational resilience as a topic is fascinating, because it applies to all of them. From my perspective, and looking at what we've done and then the research we've worked on, it's really taking a step back. And I think one step I would do is we have a survey. You can go online and say, how do I compare? There's 16 elements that we look at from organizational resilience that are divided into 4 topics: leadership, process, product, and my mind just went blank. Process, product, people. Thanks. So we started with people.
I took the quiz.
I was like, thank you. So as you do that survey, it's pretty fascinating. You actually can compare yourself to the rest of the world and different industries. And you're able to break it down and look at how you compare. And benchmarking is always fascinating from an industry perspective. So anytime I'm looking at something, I want to know, am I good or am I bad? And I try to compare it. And so what I would do is take a step at that and use some tools to make that work. So there's on our website, and I'm not doing a shameless plug, but it is something that if you're interested that you can do and look at. The other thing is from an organizational resilience standpoint, I talked about these 4 quadrants and the paradoxical thinking that looks at that. Where do you sit today? If you take a step back and you compare, the quadrants are kind of some different areas from am I reactive or proactive, essentially, or defensive, or am I a progressive company, or am I a conservative company? And you can kind of balance these things out and think about where you are today, and does that fit? Because I can't answer the question for you. Everybody's going to be different in their industry and where they want to go. But where do you want to go and how do you get there? And then you can make a map from that perspective. I'll say it's consulting 101. Here's where I am today. This is where I want to go. How do I get there? And making the roadmap. And I don't think, to be honest, you don't need consultants to help with the roadmap. A lot of it's a leadership team that you can make decisions yourself. But I think there's some tools there.
Great. Well, I want to make sure that we open for questions. If anyone has questions related to organizational resilience for our panelists, we have a mic runner. That's Kylie.
Man of many talents. Well, I'll go ahead and prime the pump here. One question I have for the group that we haven't addressed, but it was actually in some of the literature that BSI has done on building resilience, and it's something that Mindy mentioned in her talk with Carol before we came up here, was creating diverse teams and the ability to, not only is it attractive to attracting talent, but it also creates some stickiness. So where do you guys stand? I know that it's tough. I mean, looking at our panel, for instance, it's tough in the tech world specifically to get that sort of diversity, even when you actively try. So how does, I guess, start with you, Tim, how does diversity as a specific item figure into a company building organizational resilience?
So diversity has to be, it's part of the culture, I think, from my perspective. Working for a British company, I don't necessarily like the way we spell things. I don't like the way that we do a lot of things, right? It doesn't necessarily fit me, but I have a different way of thinking. Actually, creating teams that think differently is really important. And one of the things why I love organizational resilience and I'm passionate about it, one of my first, on top of my COO job that I had was, you're going to be on this organizational resilience team and work through what that means from a BSI perspective and how we help other companies understand it. So I'm not an expert by any means. There's some things that I brought to the table, but I recognize my counterparts in Asia, man, they had some great ideas on what to do that I had no idea, I wouldn't think of. So creating teams, diversity is one of those topics, it has, a definition is wide. It's not just about gender, it's not just it's about race, it's about different ways of thinking, different experiences. And I think we have to look at that holistically. And from me, I try to pull diverse teams together, which means it's hard. It makes it harder as a leader, actually, to get diverse teams together because you have to figure out how to make it all work. And I think that's one of the challenges, but I think it's instrumental in resilience, particularly when you're looking forward to challenges and how to work with challenges, having some different thoughts. And I like the comment this morning about speaking truth to power and creating a culture where that is acceptable, or not even acceptable, but expected. Is what we try to do. And organizations where I've seen that are really resilient, that I would use as examples, you can see how they work across this matrix organization to really get the best out of all of their people.
Yeah, I can give a quick example of a company that I think has done that well from the angle that we look at it, is the oil and gas company I was referencing before. They basically challenged the way that they were going to organize their work and connect it into the right people to do that work. And rather than go through their typical organizational structure for their most important initiatives across this their sales and marketing business, basically, they said, we're going to post projects and see which people across our entire organization globally are best suited to work on this project. And so there was one example that they gave us of, they ended up with a team of people that was somebody in London, which is where a lot of the power in this organization sits, somebody in Singapore, and somebody in Saskatchewan. And that 3-person team brought just such a different diversity of perspective and experience than they would ever have had on this project before. And nobody knew that this guy in Saskatchewan existed, frankly, in London and Singapore, and nobody knew that he had these skills and sets of experiences that he could bring into that project, but they ended up getting a far better outcome because they had this team of people and they had thought differently about how they organize their work and people to get them onto the work.
Yeah, and for us, I mean, I think, as you noted, technology is inevitably skewed more towards male, but what we do is kind of try to integrate across the organization. So marketing is a big partner of technology, and marketing, conversely, is almost skewed typically more female. So, from like a gender perspective, when you integrate those two teams, you get a good kind of diverse mix. As it relates to gender, and really kind of thinking through how do we break out of the silos of the kind of departments and create more cross-matrix teams, because different parts of the organization have different experiences, obviously, and then from a diversity standpoint, same thing. It's the different departments skew different ways. So we found that to be really useful. And then also we're a field-based organization, so we have a corporate office, corporate headquarters, but that's actually a smaller part of our overall organization. So we really try to integrate field-based staff with corporate to really kind of understand what the learnings are from the field, so you get different perspectives, people on the ground, on the front lines, interacting with the customers, coupled with people who are sitting in a cubicle, so to say, 8 hours a day. So you get people thinking about things in a different way.
And just to chime in, when we talk about diversity and the urgency for the organizational resilience, that's important because you need to recruit diverse people now so that they can go through that organization and be at the table making those decisions.
And retain them.
Retaining them, yes.
Recruiting's only half the battle.
Cynthia DeBartolo, CEO of Tigris Financial Partners. Resiliency is really endurance with direction. Right? It's the ability to not just bounce back, but to bounce back higher. And it's tested during the most adverse circumstances. We don't really think about it in our organizations until we are put under certain circumstances. Can you give us an example of an organization that you would consider resilient in terms of a very high resiliency or R factor that was tested during most adverse circumstances and bounced back higher?
That's a great question. I'm going to go, you're probably not going to like this example, but I'm actually going to use the U.S. military as an example. One, because I have previous background in that, and then I'll probably be thinking about another example. But that's the one that first came to my mind because the enemy has changed. The enemy has changed since I've left. The enemy has changed, and so to be able to think differently, train differently, and this is hundreds of thousands of people, changes work. How that works is empowering leaders at every pieces of the organization. So I don't use it from the perspective of they really have a lot of money, they have a lot of backing, but how their leaders work at every level of the organization. Their leaders have decision-making capability that empowers people to make a difference. So because you want the least amount of problems to come to you as possible. No, none of us. You want those decision-making and the ability to take care of issues at the lowest level possible. So by empowering our leaders and helping our leaders feel empowered to be able to make decisions, that helps really, really well. I'll give you an example that we use for organizational resilience. It was actually, so most people remember Fukushima as a nuclear disaster. So there's actually a sister plant that's 10 kilometers away that you never heard of, that had almost the exact same thing happen to it, but it actually didn't have the same outcome. It wasn't quite as bad. But looking actually Harvard Business Review actually did a work on this, if I recall. It compared the leadership style of the individuals at the two plants and what they did. And it empowered local leaders at local levels to make decisions and react quickly, which actually prevented the same thing from happening that did happen at the other nuclear facility. So I'll compare and contrast those two. But what it came down to me as I look at that, it's really about the ability of people to make a difference at every level in the organization and the lowest level possible. And that's not always, depending on your industry, that can be different, but that delegation of authority is critical where people feel empowered to be able to really be resilient when there's something really, really bad happens. To your point, it's really easy when we have our standard operating procedures and our compliance and our governance, we take track of that, we look at our KPIs. I'm a non-distributed profit company, but you think I'm a profit company the way you look at all the KPIs I have. Because we look at that and we care about it, but what really makes a difference is what don't I have to worry about? And the organization resilience isn't at the top, it's actually at the bottom. And so as we focus on empowering the bottom and making them, those individuals, feel like they can make a difference, I think that's the real difference as I look at those two scenarios in my mind. No one's ever asked me that question before. That was a good one.
Anyone else?
We love feedback like that.
So this is a two-part question, I think. And you opened up the conversation, Jordyn, with a discussion around like the top 500 companies and how many of them had been refreshed, shall we say, over the last few years.
Love that.
And I was thinking, is that a bad thing? When you were talking about why those companies were ousted and new companies entered, I was thinking, some of them may have screwed up, and screwing up is not good. We don't want to do that. And so the Fukushima example is helpful. We shouldn't, that was a bad thing. But I think most of those were displaced, not because they screwed up, but because somebody else had a better idea, and consumers and customers voted with their dollars, and other companies grew in their place, and that's a good thing. And so if in this new world, investors have a portfolio that includes large established companies and smaller startups, and employees are comfortable moving from company to company, which they are, then maybe we have too much resilience right now, and we should be looking for ways for larger companies to, with honor intact, bow out and let other newer companies take their place.
That is very controversial. As I speak from when I worked for a public company, as a public company in order to shareholders, I'd have to say that I couldn't just bow out, I have to develop. I think we have different external pressures, and depending on those pressures, provides an opportunity to do something different. But if I were in a public company, my responsibility would be to really make that company as profitable and long-lasting as possible. So I think that's important. As an individual, as a leader of an organization, I want my it's not just about the customers, it's about my stakeholders that are my employees as well. And so I think we as leaders, we have a responsibility. I'll turn this to you. What are your responsibilities? The co-owner, CEO, developing a company, how do you feel? But I will say, before I want to ask that question, it is interesting for me, innovation is one of those 16 areas that we look at from organizational resilience. In Western economies, the leaders of those Western economies in those companies have moved that down, innovation, to not as important as other areas. Whereas in Asia, particularly China and Japan, it's number one on the leader's priority. So there's some interesting pieces there that I think may be where we are from a maturity perspective. But I'd love to get your thoughts on.
Yeah.
Are we too resilient?
I don't know about that. I think it was, maybe it's good for the world to have other smaller companies being able to work nimbly, but I'm sure it wasn't good for Blockbuster, right? And I think, what I think is not good is the fact that there are large organizations that have tens of thousands of employees, and those employees aren't being used to actually generate the next innovations and create the next set of products. And that it does require like something smaller, less well-funded, and more dynamic to go about doing that. So I think the best thing for the world would be if large companies and small companies alike were able to innovate, move quickly, be dynamic, learn more about what the market needs. Because I think you wouldn't just see innovation come from the smaller companies that are nibbling at the big companies' feet. I think you'd see it from every company, and I think that would be the best thing for the world.
Great, thank you so much for that question. Samir, sorry, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing to add to that is, I think there's different ways to address that, and I think one way we approach it at Equinox is, we own a company called SoulCycle, which is an explosive brand from a cycling standpoint, and now we're looking at running, and running is really picking up, and indoor treadmill-based running is really becoming hot. So instead of making that kind of tacking that onto the core business, we're basically spinning that off and creating a new brand that's strictly focused on that and creating a new category, a new business, with its own kind of leadership team. And that's kind of how we're approaching it. Is if we feel like there's an innovative opportunity, how do we spin out and create a smaller entity that can focus on that? One, allows it to move more agilely and nimbly, but also it's a different business, and then you end up with a portfolio of businesses rather than kind of succumbing, so to say, to a startup.
That's a great question.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we could do this all day, but I gotta wrap this up here. We have to get back downstairs for the 1:30. Thank you all so very much, Jordyn, Holman, Tim, Wren, Petitti, Samir, Desai. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you enjoyed yourselves.
Thanks.